Welcome. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the 8th Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Wildfire in the West. We look forward to an exciting and informative program today. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issues series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate our students, faculty, and staff, as well as resource professionals, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence in Forest Resources, and they support the college's vision of being a world-class and internationally recognized source of knowledge relevant to environmental and natural resource issues. The mission of the College of Forest Resources is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. In our college, we focus on programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban ecosystems, and sustainable forest enterprises. Sustainability serves as the cornerstone of our programs and includes all resources such as timber, water, or wildlife, for example, considers the needs of future generations as well as those of the present, and strives for a dynamic equilibrium that balances ecological functions and conditions with social and economic factors. Today, we wish to focus on the topic of natural resource and environmental sustainability issues related to wildfire and fuel conditions throughout our western forest. Decades of effective fire suppression have created overly dense forest made up of small diameter trees of shade-tolerant species. Overcrowding and the ensuing loss of tree vigor have led to an increased risk of insect and disease attack, tree mortality, increased fuel loads, and greatly increased risk of wildfire. Protection and restoration of our forested ecosystems is essential to achieve and maintain a sustainable environment. Managing fire-prone forests through the use of thinning and prescribed fire over repetitive cycles is a critical element to regaining the balance we seek. Recently, Forest Service Chief Dale Bosworth identified 4 challenges or threats to national forest management. These include the most appropriate way to manage fire and fuels, the growing occurrence of invasive plants, animals, and diseases, the loss of open space to development, and the growing occurrence of unmanaged outdoor recreational activities. Combined, the first 2 issues are often referred to as the forest health problem, the subject of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act recently enacted by Congress. A few national-level statistics will help us understand the magnitude of the growing wildfire threat in the West. This graph shows the number of acres burned between 1960 and 2002 on Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and U.S. Forest Service lands, plus all state lands. The 7 million acres burned in 2002 have only been exceeded in magnitude 3 times over the last 44 years. Yet, this is happening despite a decrease in the number of fires occurring each year. As a consequence, the fires that do occur are much larger in size. And as shown on this graph, between 1994 and 2002, the dollars spent fighting wildfires have increased dramatically. This graph only includes cost for the 5 federal agencies previously listed. Not depicted is the additional fact that many wildfires are destroying structures and taking human life in the urban-rural interface, as well as on wildlands, and that the severity of the fires is much worse due to the heavy fuel loads. The topic in today's Denman Forestry Issues series is wildfire in the West. We are joined by speakers from government agencies, conservation groups, and higher education. Our moderator for this program is Professor James Agee from the UW College of Forest Resources. Jim is a nationally recognized expert in fire ecology. Thank you for joining us for this Denman Forestry Issues series.
Fire has been around with us for a much longer time than actually we have been around as a species. Lightning fires have been common ever since life has been on the earth, and it's not at all surprising that we should find that many plants have co-evolved with fire and have actually developed some remarkable adaptations. Out in the West, we have species which have very thick bark, which protects them against surface fires. We also have species that have what we call serotinous or late opening cones, where the cones produce viable seed, but the seed remains inside the cone sealed with a very thin band of resin and can last for decades in that position, waiting for a very hot fire to come along and to open those cones. So we have adaptations to different kinds of fire on the landscape. The spread of fire-adapted vegetation probably has also been mediated by Native American fires, particularly over the last 10,000 years in North America. Now, when we look at the Northwest as any region, we find that there are a variety of different environments that occur, and it's not surprising then that the interaction that those environments have with fire might also vary across the landscape. If we were to take, for example, a transect from Seattle to the Columbia River on Interstate 90, we would go from the very wet Cascades across to a drying forest landscape and eventually into non-forest sagebrush country. Associated with that transect would also be a variety of fire regimes. And across the West, we typically classify them in three major types for forests. One we call the high severity fire regime. This is a fire regime where fires are quite infrequent. Typically, the average fire return interval exceeds 100 years. And when those fires occur, typically the fire itself is stand replacement. That is, all the trees in the forest are killed, either because it's a crown fire or because many of these trees may not be very well adapted. They may have something like thin bark, which doesn't hold up very well even to intense surface fires. We have a second category called mixed severity fire regimes, where fires are a little bit more frequent than in the high severity fire regimes, maybe every 25 to 75 years, but with a very complex mix of severities at a very local scale. So we have a little patch of where a crown fire has occurred, another patch where the trees have been thinned out, and another patch which is underburned with a very low intensity fire, very interspersed across the landscape. And finally, we have low severity fire regimes. Historically, fires were very frequent in those particular forest environments, but typically they were low intensity fires. If there was any fire regime that would be called the friendly flame, it was this one. And this is the fire regime, these low severity fire regimes, where most of our current problem exists. When we look at the historical high severity fire regimes, this is a subalpine fir forest in eastern Washington. Fires always behave this way in subalpine fir forests. Typically fairly intense, almost always stand replacing, and a typically average fire return interval exceeding 100 years. That's also true for many of our West Cascade forests, such as lowland Douglas fir and western hemlock, Pacific silver fir and mountain hemlock on the west side. Our historical mixed severity fire regimes is this intermediate fire frequency and this very complex mixture of patches on the landscape. So if we see here, we've got about a 10-year-old fire in the background here. You can see that the little opening there is a little stand replacement patch. There's also areas where the forest has been thinned and other areas where it's simply been underburned. And if we move to the foreground here, we see that there's also another fire, a little bit older, about 50 years old here, that has that same kind of a pattern. The even textured areas are areas where stand replacement fire occurred about 50 years ago. And the more textured patches on those landscapes is where either a mixed or a low severity fire burned in that landscape, creating over time a very complex patch mosaic in these mixed severity fire regimes. There are fire problems here in mixed severity fire regimes, but typically they pale in comparison with the priority that probably needs to be associated with the historical low severity fire regimes. On our left is a map of the distribution of ponderosa pine across the west, throughout the Sierra Nevada, the Klamath-Siskiyou region, the eastern Cascades, through low elevations of the Rocky Mountains, Front Range of Colorado, and down through Arizona and New Mexico. Typically either pure ponderosa pine or where pine is mixed with other conifers. It might be lodgepole pine, it could be white fir, grand fir, or Douglas fir. Historical conditions probably looked a little bit like this cartoon. We don't have very many places that have historical conditions yet, so a cartoon is about the best we can do. Fires typically were very frequent. This would be probably a very typical flame length of a foot or two. It would kill this little tree down here in the foreground, and it would probably burn up this dead log over here to the left, creating and maintaining a fairly open landscape that was oftentimes herb dominated. So this area would green up the next spring, and that green understory would help retard the intensity of the next fire as it came along as well. These open forests had trees with thick bark, they had trees with tall crowns, and fires kept them very widely spaced. So this was a forest type where ecosystem stability was actually maintained by frequent fire. Historically, we had a distribution of fire regimes that looked kind of like this in the interior Columbia Basin. If we were to extend this record over to the west side, it would largely be of the high severity type, and that's not shown here. The white areas in the east in this graph, in this figure, are non-forest types. And the green areas that you see there are the historical low severity fire regimes. The gold is the mixed severity, and the red is high severity. Now in this next figure, the non-forest areas are shown in black, but you notice there's been a major expansion of the red, that we've actually transformed low severity fire regimes to high severity fire regimes. And this is the root of the problem. How did we get this way? Well, we can obviously blame policy of fire exclusion, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more, but there are also other factors. Grazing was also important, selective logging, where we took the most fire-tolerant trees out of the forest, and also some other factors which we've begun to recognize, things like policy shifts. Not only perhaps a less aggressive policy in order to provide more safety for firefighters, but issues associated with letting some fires burn, and when they've gotten to a certain size, making a decision to put them out, which adds them into the wildfire acreage burn categories. And there also might be a climate signal in these statistics that we've seen in the last couple of decades. Fire exclusion. We began to effectively exclude fire from many of our forests in and or about the turn of the 20th century. At that time, our fledgling forest management organizations like the Forest Service were just coming into their own. They had just been created, and one of the key issues that they had was how we were going to protect the forests of the future. And they thought very much that keeping small trees alive was important, and it was. And so out of that developed a policy that we should exclude fire as much as possible from forests. And in order to do that, a major policy of fire suppression and fire prevention came into play. Smokey the Bear has often been blamed for this problem. Fire prevention has always been important. It is and it remains important, and it will be important into the future, that we keep unwanted fires out of the forest. So fire prevention is still going to be important as we move into the future. But Smokey's not going to be able to say it all in one sentence anymore. It's a much more complex issue than it once was. Grazing was also important, and it wasn't just a few animals on the range. There were a lot of animals on the range, not only cattle, but also sheep, removing a lot of the fine fuels that historically carried fires through the forest, and also churning up the ground sufficiently that it was a good seed bed for trees to get started. And these little trees weren't killed by fires because fires were taken out of that environment. Pick and pluck logging. Here's a kind of a compilation where a big landing, logs have been brought in. You can see that they're all big trees. These are all the most fire-tolerant trees in the landscape, and they're being removed selectively. Most of these were probably made into apple boxes. That's what we did with big trees back in those days. We fooled ourselves into thinking this policy would work forever. It worked very well for a while, up till and through and after World War II. We saw a decline in acreage burn statistics, which is this graph down at the bottom here. Here we have acres burned, and we have time from the early 20th century up to roughly today. And you can see that at first we got a decline in acreage burned, and then since World War II, things have slowly been increasing with a big pump up here in area burned, and in particularly in fire severity in the last decade or so. Why is this the case? Here's an example of some of the ecological change that we see in these forest types. Now, this is a historic forest. There's been a little bit of pick and pluck logging in here. Standing next to this gentleman down here, you can see that there's a couple of stumps, but the forest is still largely intact. It's mostly a ponderosa pine forest. 20 years later, it's being colonized by very young Douglas fir trees. Another 10 years later, those Douglas fir trees are increasing in size, and another 10 years later, and we have what we call a tree jungle. Now, if we consider in that open forest how a fire might have historically behaved, it would have been a friendly flame kind of fire. Would have meandered through that understory. There was a lot of green herbage there that would have also helped to retard the flames. Now we have a lot more dead fuel buildup, and that dead fuel is going to catch into what we call these ladder fuels of small trees and get carried directly up into the crown. And we've changed at really regional scales our historical low severity fire regimes to those of high severity. Associated with the major fires that we had in Southern California last year, that was finally the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, and the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003 was passed. It has a variety of various titles within the act itself, but the one that specifically deals with fire and restoring more fire-resilient forests has these elements associated with it. It's limited to a variety of ecosystems that we see here, either wildland interface areas. Those are areas where forest is mixed with housing. Short interval fire regimes in poor conditions. Those are the kinds of forests I've been talking about, these dry forest types, historical low severity. Catastrophically disturbed land, and threatened and endangered species habitat where those species depend very much on fire. For example, the red cockaded woodpecker down in the southeast, which needs longleaf pine. There's a limit on how much can be treated. There's a focus on small diameter trees and fuel breaks and prescribed fire, all of which are, I think, relevant to the issue at hand. The controversial points associated with this is that although environmental analysis is needed, that review of that is relatively limited by the courts. And finally, there's a monitoring element in there, which can be paid by operational dollars. So there are I think, some very promising developments in this, but a lot of it depends on how it plays out on the land. This is a stand here that's been thinned. It's also been burned, and you can see there's a couple of little dead trees. If I can find my pointer here, there's one there, and there's one there, and there's a couple in the stand there that have been killed by this low-intensity prescribed fire. Notice how the forest floor has greened up. This is going to be a very fire-resilient forest. That is, most of the basal area and density of this forest will be retained in a worst-case wildfire in the summertime. But I would maintain to you, if we do it right, that there can be a major landscape benefit across the West, both from prescribed fire and from thinning. In prescribed fire, though, if we want to use prescribed fire alone, it has to be a multi-step process. Our first fire up here is going to be consuming fuels, but it's also going to be killing a lot of the little trees, the ladder fuels, so it's going to create fuels at the same time. We're going to have to then clean up those fuels as they fall, and after probably 2 fires in a typical mixed conifer forest, we can create relatively fire-safe conditions for at least a couple of decades into the future. Restoration harvest can also help if we follow these principles. Thin from below, That is, take the small trees, work towards the larger ones. Remove ladder fuels. Those are largely the smaller trees. Clean up the slash so that a surface fire coming through is not going to be more intense than it would be before. And leave the large trees because they're the most fire tolerant. This is an area here, this area that's listed as fuel break, down in the lower portion of this slide, is an area that was treated with those principles. Small trees were removed. As you can see from looking down on the canopy, you don't see a lot of ground. A lot of canopy was left. A prescribed burn was put through there, and then a wildfire occurred 2 years later. The untreated area you can see is mostly stand replacement, and the so-called fuel break area hardly lost a tree at all. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that we know that stand level treatments can work. I think we have a lot of uncertainties when we begin to expand that up to a landscape level, and I think we'll hear a lot more about that from some of our other speakers. Public trust is a key constraint. If public continues to think that managers out there are doing the wrong thing, it's going to be very difficult to maintain this program over time. And finally and lastly, one of the most difficult things is that we know that if we begin to more actively treat landscapes that we're going to have some environmental impacts. But we need to be able to evaluate those impacts against the risk of no action, because no action is not really nothing happens. No action is the risk of wildfire. And we know that there are a variety of ecological and economic and social values that are lost when these severe wildfires burn across our dry forest landscapes. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to introduce the remainder of our speakers today. Our next speaker is going to be David Peterson, and Dave is a research biologist with the Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Laboratory. This is affiliated with the Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station. He is also a professor here in the College of Forest Resources, and he's going to be speaking about fire science tools and challenges. Dave?
Today I'd like to do basically an overview of the kinds of tools that are currently available for scientists and managers to use in fire science. And if we just start with this diagram here, which is not unlike some of the photos that Professor Agee showed you, this is our stereotypical view of a condition on the left, which is what we currently have on much of the landscape, particularly in our drier forests, and the condition on the right, which is our target or reference to which we would like to move forest structure. As a way of framing what I'm going to talk about today, I would like to suggest that we look at 4 guiding questions relative to fire and forest restoration. First of all, what is the reference condition to which we would like to return forest stand structures and landscapes? Number 2, how can forest structure be modified to reduce crown fire hazard? Number 3, how can surface fuels be modified to reduce crown fire hazard? And number 4, which pattern of forests and fuels on the landscape will help to reduce fire spread at very large spatial scales? Let's look at this first question, the reference condition. This is a subject of great debate. Professor Agee mentioned to you the value of things like fire history, and I'm going to reiterate that right here. The fire history data essentially provides a context, not the only context, but a context which can create a target for our restoration efforts, and that's relative to frequency and extent of fire occurrence. Now, the value of this data is that we can acquire it over a very broad portion of the western landscape. The disadvantage is that it covers only the last 500 years or so, so it's a fairly limited temporal perspective. And most of the data actually comes before 1900, because after 1900, fires became much less frequent due to the number of reasons that Professor Agee mentioned. We also need to be aware that there were lots of humans living on this landscape for thousands of years, and that when we talk about concepts like natural range of variability as a target for restoration and fire, we need to consider the fact that humans were out there starting fires either purposefully or benignly for many thousands of years. Let's move now to our second question. How can forest structure be modified to reduce crown fire hazard? And I've indicated here diagrammatically what we're talking about. moving from an overhead view of a canopy. We'd like to go from something that looks like this to something that looks like this. And a cross section, we can see a fairly dense forest with lots of understory and ladder fuels moving to a much more open stand structure. And there are some fairly basic principles that have been well established now by fire scientists that we can deal with. One is we just need to raise the base of the canopy. So here you can see the canopies are very close to the ground, and we need to get those canopies up here where the flames can't reach them quite so easily. Another concept which is starting to be understood to a greater extent is canopy bulk density. And this refers simply to the mass or biomass of living and dead material over a certain volume. So all of this material in this upper diagram represents a very high bulk density. And if we can remove a lot of that bulk density, it reduces the opportunity for flames to spread either from the surface upwards or to spread laterally through the crown should a fire get started in the crown. And then finally, crown continuity, which is not so easy to quantify, but again, this gets at the idea of we need to get the crowns of the dominant trees far enough apart so that if one or two of these trees should torch and start on fire, it won't spread from crown to crown continuously, especially when you have high winds that often occur under severe fire weather. One little tool that's been very helpful in allowing silviculture to meet fire science is called the Forest Vegetation Simulator. This has been worked on for some 30 years, and it has various forms now, but it's widely used in the Forest Service and by other public agencies. And basically what that allows you to do is to grow forests on the computer. So we can go from a stand like this that through time develops into a different stand structure. This is important because it essentially allows you to look into the future and to do some planning on what you want your forest to look like. In this next slide, I want you to look very fast because I'm going to point out the little animation here that's only going to happen once. We see this fire continuing to burn through this stand. And this is a diagrammatic representation of something that's called the Fire and Fuels Extension of the Forest Vegetation Simulator. So basically, we can not only grow forests now on the computer, but we can also burn them down with the Fire and Fuels Extension. And what this does is simply it calculates the potential for fuels to create different types of surface fires or crown fires, and then to calculate what the effects of those fires might be in terms of tree mortality, change in species composition, and so forth. So this is a good example of how we've taken an existing tool, FVS, and modified it with good fire science knowledge, and this truly is where silviculture meets fire science in this particular analytical tool. Now the advantage of this particular tool is it's sort of a time-honored one now in the Forest Service and other agencies, and more people are now using it, but it's still sufficiently difficult to operate analytically that it's not something the average person on the ground necessarily can do without a fair amount of training. Another good tool that's been developed here at the College of Forest Resources is the landscape management system, and this allows us to take the kinds of products developed by the Forest Vegetation Simulator and put it on large landscapes so we can see the mosaic of different kinds of forest types, ages, and structures over a broad spatial region. It also allows us to look at stands developing through time, and we can compare, in this case, the upper set of slides where we did not have a treatment and the lower set of slides where we show the effectiveness of a thinning and then how that forest structure changes through time. The point here is that when you do a thinning, you can't just walk away from it. You have to project out and see what that stand structure is going to look like 10, 20, 30 years in the future. Let's move now to our third question. How can surface fuels be modified to reduce crown fire hazard? And this reiterates the extremely important point that Professor Agee made. You can't just do a thinning and walk away from these stands, that you have to treat the surface fuels, particularly if there are sufficient fuels there to create crown fire hazard. And we have to incorporate that in both our ecological and economic objectives. So the effectiveness of any particular forest thinning has to be looked at in the context of the potential of the residual surface fuels to create or initiate a crown fire. And this is the area where there's been the most work in fire science and the Forest Service and beyond. There are a lot of tools for looking at surface fuels and for looking at fire behavior. And scientists now recognize that being able to accurately quantify surface fuel characteristics is perhaps the major gap that we have in any particular forest landscape. There are millions and millions of acres out there, and we have good data for only a very small percentage of those acres. One of the central foci of this area of research has been what are called fuel models. These have been around for some 35 years now, and they're essentially prototypes or mathematical representations of fuel types, roughly grouped into grass, shrub, timber, and slash, and they are designed to feed into what are called fire spread models, and they also estimate potential fire behavior under wildfire or prescribed fire situations, and they also predict fire danger under any particular fuel conditions. A new type of fuel classification system is called FCCS, or Fuel Characteristic Classification System. This goes well beyond surface fuels and considers crown fuels, shrub fuels, and all the strata that are indicated in this diagram. It also more fully recognizes not just what's going on down here at the surface, but also how things can spread from the surface up into the crown. We also cannot forget that there are a number of fire effects that occur well after that flaming front has passed, and these kinds of fires are called smoldering or residual fires, and they account for a lot of the smoke and air pollution and some of the tree mortality that occurs after the dramatic part of the fire is over. Another characteristic of this new system is that it calculates fire potentials, again, not just for surface fire potential, but also for extreme fire potential, including torching of individual trees, crown fire, as well as ecological fire effects that may occur during and after the flaming front has passed. Finally, I'd like to get to the most challenging point in my talk today, and that is which pattern of forest and fuels will reduce fire spread at large spatial scales. Probably the most exciting advance that we've had in recent years is this tool called FARSIGHT, or the Fire Area Simulator. And you can see here in the diagram on the right where FARSIGHT initiates fire spread across landscapes. So given data for a particular location, you have topographic information, you have fuels information, and you have weather information. FARSIGHT can calculate fire spread in that landscape. Another fire simulator called FireTech is now in the research phase, and this is kind of an exciting tool because it's based on first principles of physics. And it simulates fire spread for layers of grass or overstory forest, and in the few cases where it's been tested and validated, it does a pretty good job at simulation. I would like to suggest to you that we will make significant progress on fuel treatments in the next few years, and we will make significant progress on fire science tools. How we put that together in a public policy context, an economic context, and get the support of the general public as well as the agencies to do this will, to a great degree, determine the success of our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Our next speaker is Professor Claire Ryan. Claire is an associate professor in the College of Forest Resources here at the University of Washington, and she also holds an adjunct appointment in the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Affairs, also here on campus. Today she's going to talk with us about human dimensions of wildland fires. Claire?
Thanks, Jim, for that introduction. Today I'll be talking about the human dimensions of wildland fires. And in the short time that I have, I agree with Professor Agee that we need to understand the context of this issue, and I'll talk a little bit about how we got here. Highlight a little bit of the research on social aspects and human aspects of fire, and then speak a little bit about what the future holds. I think the last two talks have started to converge on this idea that we have a lot of knowledge about fire, and I'll be explaining some of the knowledge we have about humans, but how do we meld those and address this problem? And then I want to refer you to some useful resources. I had to learn a lot to do this talk, so there's some very helpful resources out there on this topic. And as we know, that a lot of the recent fires across the U.S. have really focused attention on this issue, especially the social and economic impacts of fire. And we have these images of homes consumed by flames, families left homeless, communities overwhelmed by smoke, heavy economic burdens. These are things that we don't quickly forget, and I'm sure many of you can call up an image from recent fires, recent coverage of those fires. And obviously, as has been mentioned, after World War II, we saw quite a lot of movement, people moving out of urban areas, moving into and choosing to live in suburban areas, and areas where there's just more forest or fire-prone vegetation. So each year, we see more people moving out into these areas. The challenge of kind of managing the ecosystem and managing the people that are in those ecosystems grows every year. Along with that growth, there's a high chance that those people moving out into those areas will experience fire, and this chance continues to grow, this probability continues to grow. So this issue probably isn't going to go away in the near future. And there's another important reason, and like Professor Agee, I'm not blaming Smokey, but there was a very successful public education campaign that I think has contributed to some of the situation or the context, is that you really have this image that we should exclude fire, as Professor Agee noted. And historically, this message was very effective in focusing on prevention, and perhaps what we need to do is update this message and help Smokey set prescribed fires or some message like that. But there's a sense that the human understanding of fire is still a little bit more towards the end of fire is bad, although that understanding has changed. And there is quite a lot of research that shows that perception of fire has evolved, that people are starting to become aware that fire can serve a positive ecological, or provide positive ecological benefits, and it can result in a constructive role. So this is slowly evolving. And I think our ecological understanding has been quicker than kind of the public perception and the public understanding of fire. So those two don't quite match up, and there still is a gap there. And what it's also illustrated is that the fire management community has really started to recognize the need for research from the scientific disciplines that study human behavior, human institutions, and culture. So in other words, the social science disciplines are really needed to help address these fire management issues. One example would be that after the fires of 2000, we saw a lot of funding go towards fire research. And just the National Fire Plan alone funded $26 million towards fire research. About $4 million of that was dedicated towards social science funding, which was kind of unprecedented in the history of social science research in this area. So there's quite a lot of research that's occurred in the last couple of years, and I want to highlight a little bit of that research, not only funded by the National Fire Plan, but funded by other communities, industries, and collectively looking at this. And it tends to fall into some major categories, and I don't want to go into great detail on all of these, but a large part of the research falls under looking at how communities are responding, what are the impacts of fire. So they look at how communities mobilize, what are some of the economic impacts, how are they preparing for fire, how have they done fuel reduction activities, what kinds of educational techniques have been used. So there's a large amount of research in that area. Another big chunk of research looks at agency responses, not just federal agencies, but state and local agencies as well. Again, similar kinds of topics. What kinds of education have been undertaking? What kind of technical support has been there to help communities respond to fire? An interesting thing that's come out of these two research categories paired is that communities and humans really don't see jurisdictional differences. They see an agency. They don't know if it's a federal agency, a state agency, a local agency. They may know, but they may not care, is the point that comes out. And so I think the message for agencies is that we, as an agency, tend to be kind of driven by jurisdictional boundaries, that communities, people living in those communities don't see those boundaries, and they don't care what those boundaries are. And so part of the research that I'll talk about later talks about blending those boundaries or erasing those boundaries as a way of getting beyond this. Another big chunk of research looks at homeowner attitudes, and there's a large amount of research on this, especially the issue of whether homeowners are aware of the risk of living in certain kinds of areas, what kind of knowledge they have about prevention activities, and then what prevention activities, if any, do they undertake, and there's quite a lot of those. So there's a large percentage of residents that do take action, actually a pretty high percentage in studies across the United States, well over 50%. May not be enough, but there's a large percentage of homeowners that are aware, understand the risk, and are taking action. Lately, too, a lot of issue about smoke and whether certain levels of smoke are acceptable or not, and I'll mention that in just a few minutes. And all of this, the attitude, especially the attitude research, does document this change kind of in the 70s and 80s that really suggests that there is a shift in the public belief and the public views of fire, that fire can be beneficial. So that view is changing slowly. Another, to continue this theme of kind of what research is being done, similar to homeowner attitudes, there's been a number of different studies that really look at behavior and why homeowners would implement certain kinds of activities, and really looking at what their motivations are and what some of the incentives for those activities are. And these are all the kinds of things that you've read about in terms of different kinds of roofing materials, thinning plants around your home, using fire retardant coatings on different kinds of structures, making sure there's a water supply. There's a long, long list of those kinds of behaviors that then linked with some of the community prevention efforts, which is another level of this, that really understands, together with individual behavior and community behavior, what kinds of activities at the community level are taking place, and especially why are those efforts taking place. And I'll talk about those in just a few minutes. As I mentioned previously, there's again an effort to understand what agencies are doing and what kinds of programs, and this area really looks at more what kinds of programs are being delivered or implemented that try to understand some of the social aspects, the social context, and documenting basically educational programs, and these two are linked, and how effective those are. And I have an example there. There's really a sense in a lot of this research, especially for the agency and kind of the educational programs, that people seem to think that the awareness is not there, or the awareness of risk is not present. And many of these show that the awareness is really there. And what the problem is that humans like to live in denial, and we see humans denying the risk and continuing the behavior, or you see success stories where humans understand the risk and then take an action. And usually that's linked with a set of technical information, some incentives, some community kinds of programs. So I'll talk about that in a few minutes. The other issue that keeps coming up is, well, who's responsible? Whose responsibility is it? Whose responsibility is this problem? Is it the individual homeowner? Is it the community? Is it the agencies? And the answer is none of the above. It's basically everyone's responsibility. So there's often some arguing and dispute about whose responsibility, so I'm not going to do anything because it's not my responsibility, my property ends here. And many of the more successful programs have actually gotten past that and have worked on sharing that responsibility. So a couple of examples. I mentioned education because many times we hear the comment that, well, if people only knew, or if we educated them about this, then they would make the behavior changes that we think are necessary. And the research shows that education not surprisingly, is not as simple as we might think. This study was in a recent Journal of Forestry article, and it tried to examine over time changes in attitudes towards fire management programs in Washington and Oregon. So looking at fire management programs in the national forests in the Blue Mountain area from 1996 till about 2000. And what was interesting here was that the source of the educational program really makes a difference. The attitudes were very supportive toward activities like prescribed burning, thinning, so those communities continued to have a similar level of support, tree removal, those kinds of things. But most people didn't get their information from the agency. They got their information from neighbors, from community groups, from other sources. And those were the most effective sources in the view of those people for useful sources of information. So there's kind of a sense that maybe a mismatch between an agency program and how it's delivered. The other key point of this was that these relationships matter, and that public acceptance of some of these fire and fuel management techniques is really a product of interactions over time. You can't just do the program and leave. The other big chunk of research that I thought was interesting was an assessment of how communities are really preparing for fire. And this was a big study that's conducted nationwide through the National Fire Plan funding. And collectively, these studies are suggesting that these are some dimensions that seem to be important and are important in communities that have actually undertaken some pretty serious efforts to prepare for fire. The keys that emerge out of this are that social capital is important, and that's really defined as kind of the characteristics of a community that lead to action. Why do different communities take action, and why do some communities not take action? And leadership here, whether it was individual or some group, was a key component in that social capital. Like social capital, human capital is important. That's the knowledge, the skill, the expertise, and this is gained through different sources of education and training. So do you have the knowledge in your community to start preparing for fire? And then cultural capital was an interesting one, because these cases really identified this as a key point. It's like human capital, but it's knowledge and skills that are gained through heritage or experience or other sources. So not the traditional sources, but what are the cultural place attachment kinds of things, and how do you work with those as well? And all of those then lead to kind of a resiliency. And there was this factor of these communities had a sense that they were resilient. They could respond, they could weather the storm, so to speak. And not to shortchange the agencies. The other study suggested that maybe the agencies weren't the most effective in educating. The agencies were very, very key in being involved in providing expertise, providing funding, providing information to these communities. So not to suggest that the agencies shouldn't be involved. They really need to be there, and communities are looking for agencies to be involved. And finally, there's this idea of a landscape, which tends to be traditionally kind of an ecological context, but this is more of a social landscape. What are the social aspects of a landscape? In many of these communities, the point here was that residents have to understand the context that they're living in. And people that have been there for a while, northern Minnesota, for example, they had an example that people know they're in a very remote landscape, so they can't count on services or other responses, and it's up to them or their community to respond. And so having a kind of an expanded definition of the landscape that you're living in is not just an ecological, but what's the social landscape. So let me give you an example there of one of these cases. Two recent fires near Bend, Oregon, 1990, 1996, really brought this issue home. And Bend, Oregon is in central Oregon. It's a high desert city of about 52,000. The county is about 115,000, but it's one of the fastest growing areas of the state. And the big challenge here for this area has been, how do you manage the expansion of homes and subdivisions into these forested areas, these fire-prone areas? And after these two fires, as Safeco, an insurance company, was starting to pay off and dealing with a lot of the economic impact, they said, there's a mismatch here. There's got to be something else we can do. So the insurance company started this and said, we're going to offer some seed money to this community to help them prepare for fire, to reduce the risk as they looked at what they were paying off in premium and insurance payments. So this fire program is called Fire Free. Again, started with this insurance company kind of providing the seed money, but generally the program really stresses individual responsibility. And there's a core belief that individuals do make a difference, and that's a very consistent message in this case, that yes, if only one homeowner does this, this will in fact make a difference. So the education, the management techniques are really delivered in a number of different ways: media, neighbors, community groups, agencies, different kinds of educational techniques, but the message is that yes, it's an individual responsibility as well as a community responsibility. And in this case too, that you saw that it was very clear that peer pressure and community pressure was an important component to getting communities to respond, or getting individuals to respond. And there was a number of programs where volunteer cleanup from fire department or other agencies, they'd show up at someone's house and say, we'll clear your brush and we'll take it to the landfill for free. So you're participating whether or not you're doing the work. A lot of those kinds of techniques. Networks were important as well, and this gets back to this issue of kind of who's delivering the information and where the information comes from. Very, very heavy use of existing civic organizations, homeowner associations, professional associations to communicate the messages. So you got the message, but it wasn't necessarily from a government agency. In this case, I think also shows the real collaboration. It's not just up to an individual, it's up to the community. And you saw local business, government organizations, homeowner associations, nonprofits, all involved in this case and preparing and taking some of the responsibility. One of the things in this case that's mentioned, and I think is a challenge in many areas, is there's many new residents in these areas who may not have the same kind of what they call sense of place. They're drawn there because of the natural beauty or the amenities, but they're not as connected with some of the historical, maybe historical fire events or the historical significance of those events. And the challenge is working with those new residents so they understand that, and then an even greater challenge is kind of the residents that may not be there full time, so kind of the part-time or absentee residents. How do you work with them and engage them in this process? But this was just one of those cases that was mentioned in that report. So what you see is kind of this, again, a mosaic of many different elements that are combined, not just an individual, not just an agency, not just a company, but community groups, training. Here you saw the company start the thing. The community groups ran with this program, provided training. Businesses got involved, agencies got involved, and kind of developed this momentum that made it seem to work. And we'll see when the next fire happens. But I want to move on a little bit to what does the future hold? More fires? Maybe, maybe not. If we can manage the ecological landscape, we may be able to control some of those fires, but we may not be able to do that in the time that we think is needed. So many of these communities and much of the research suggests that we just should prepare for fire and expect fire to happen, and learn from these cases and this other research that's been conducted. What are the conditions that are necessary to really support these community efforts and the individual efforts? And those are things like those cases illustrated that I just mentioned: expertise, information, funding, some flexibility, and some allowance for innovation. But again, it's not just a one-time kind of thing. It's a long-term investment. And it's very clear in many of these cases, if you look at these reports and the research, that it's a partnership. It's, as I've said, many different pieces have to fit together so that the communities are prepared. And finally, I think, again, we know that humans don't like change. We don't change our behaviors quickly. We don't change our behavior even with information that we think might cause that behavior to change. So we do need time to change perceptions of fire and then to change individual behaviors. And as I mentioned, that attitude of fire being bad is changing. It's changing slowly, and it's probably changing more slowly than some of our ecological knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ryan. This concludes session 1 on wildfire in western forests. We've spent the first hour or so talking about issues and research, and our next session will be session 2, dealing with desired future conditions.